He grabbed her by the wrist in front of the whole town and dragged her onto that wooden platform like she was a sack of grain he'd been meaning to sell before the market closed. $40, Harold Whitmore called out to the crowd below, his voice carrying the practiced ease of a man who had made this decision long before today. She's strong, she's quiet, and she won't give you trouble. The crowd didn't gasp. That was the worst part. They just looked. If you've ever felt like the world assigned you a price you never agreed to, hit that like button, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and subscribe so you don't miss a single chapter of what happens next. This is the kind of story that stays with you. The morning it happened, Mara Whitmore woke before dawn the way she always did, quietly, without complaint, moving through the dark like someone who had learned early that making noise only brought trouble to your door. She'd made coffee. She'd fed the 2 chickens that were left. She'd swept the porch without being asked, because that was how she survived in that house, by staying useful, by staying small, by giving Harold Whitmore no reason to look her direction with that flat, calculating expression she had learned to dread more than his anger. His anger, at least, was honest. It was the flat look that always meant something was coming. She heard him moving around inside before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, and she registered the sound of his good boots. Not his work boots, not the cracked leather pair he wore to muck the stalls, but the dark ones he kept wrapped in cloth under his bed. And something in her chest tightened without knowing why. "You're up," he said from the doorway. "Yes, sir." "Good." He looked at her the way you look at something you've decided to part with, not with cruelty exactly, more like finality. "Get cleaned up, wear the gray dress." Mara turned slowly from the porch railing. "Are we going somewhere?" "I am," Harold said. "You're coming with me." She asked no more questions. She had learned long ago that questions got you nothing in that house except a longer silence and a harder morning. She went inside, washed her face from the basin, put on the gray dress that hung loose at the shoulders because she'd lost weight over the winter and no one had noticed. She braided her hair. She pulled on her boots. She followed him to the wagon, and she told herself the tightness in her chest was nothing. She had felt it before. She had been wrong before. Maybe they were just going to Dust Creek for supplies. Maybe Harold had found work. Maybe this was going to be an ordinary day and she was only borrowing worry from a future that hadn't arrived yet. The wagon turned onto the main road, and Harold didn't speak for the first 20 minutes. Then he said, "I owe Victor Crow $300. Mara kept her eyes on the road ahead. "I know." "You know." "I heard you talking last week, through the wall." Harold's jaw moved once, like he was chewing something unpleasant, and then he said, "Victor's called it in. All of it. By end of month." "What are we going to do?" she asked. And she said "we" because that was still how she thought about it. The 2 of them, the remaining fragment of a family, still somehow a unit, even when everything else had fallen away. Harold said nothing. Mara waited. "Harold," she said, "what are we going to do?" "I've made arrangements," he said. And that was all he said for the rest of the drive. Cool. Dust Creek on a Saturday morning had a particular kind of energy that Mara had always found difficult to describe. It wasn't exactly lively, and it wasn't exactly tense. It was something in between, like a crowd that had gathered around a card game they weren't sure was honest but couldn't stop watching. People moved between the general store and the saloon, between the feed yard and the livery, and they talked and laughed and argued the way frontier people always did when they had a day away from the hard work of surviving. Mara climbed down from the wagon and waited for Harold to tie the horse. A few people glanced at her. She recognized them. She'd grown up in this town. She'd gone to school here for 3 years before Harold decided it wasn't worth the walk. She'd bought flour from old Silas at the general store and had her shoes mended by Mrs. Pemberton, whose husband had died the winter before last and who had become somehow both harder and softer in the years since. Nobody smiled at her. Nobody was particularly unfriendly either. She existed in Dust Creek the way a lot of things existed there. Noticed when useful, ignored otherwise. Harold came around the wagon and put his hand on her arm, and something about the grip, not rough, but certain, like a man directing livestock through a gate, sent the tightness in her chest spreading outward into her hands, her fingers. "Come on," he said. "Where are we going?" He didn't answer. He walked her to the center of town, where the platform had been set up in the open square between the saloon and the hardware store. Mara had seen that platform before. She'd seen them auction off a mule on it. She'd seen a man stand trial on it once, 3 years back, when Dust Creek had briefly considered itself civilized enough for a public hearing before deciding a quieter form of justice was more efficient. Now there were maybe 30 people gathered around it. Not a crowd exactly, but enough. Enough to be an audience. Enough to be a verdict. Harold walked her right up to the steps, and she stopped moving. "Harold." Her voice was quiet. Very quiet. "What is this?" "Don't make a scene," he said, and the calm in his voice was the worst thing about it. The way a man sounds when he's gone past doubt and into decision, when everything worth arguing about has already been settled in his own head. "I need you to go up there and be decent about this." "About what?" It wasn't a question. She already knew. Something in her body had known before her mind caught up, because her legs had stopped working the way you stop in the road when you finally see what you've been walking toward. "Victor Crow has a buyer," Harold said. "Man's been looking for a capable woman for his household staff, good position, steady wage." "Harold, the debt gets cleared. You get a paying position. Everybody walks away from this better than they came in." He said it like he'd rehearsed it. He probably had. "Now come on." "I'm not going up there." His hand tightened on her arm. "I'm not a thing you can sell," she said, and her voice shook, not from fear, not entirely, but from the collision of knowing something and finally hearing it out loud, finally seeing it named. "You hear me? I am not a thing." "Lower your voice," he said. "Let go of my arm." People were watching now. She could feel it, the slight shift in the crowd, the way attention moves like water toward the place where something might break. A few people stepped closer, a few stepped back. Someone laughed, though whether at her or at something unrelated, she couldn't tell. Harold looked at her with that flat expression, and she saw the calculation in it, the weighing, and then he said very quietly, "You don't have any money, Mara. You don't have anywhere to go. You don't have anyone." A pause. "What exactly are you going to do?" She didn't have an answer. She hated that she didn't have an answer. He walked her up the steps. Standing on that platform was like having the ground removed from beneath her feet, while the world kept moving normally around her. The crowd below didn't look hostile exactly. They looked interested in the particular way that people look when something unusual is happening and hasn't yet required them to have an opinion about it. A woman to her left whispered something to the man beside her. An older man near the back crossed his arms and watched with the patient expression of a man waiting for a transaction to complete. Harold stood to the side, slightly behind her, and he said to the crowd, $40 for her service, good worker, strong constitution, no trouble. No trouble. Mara stared at a point on the horizon and made herself very still inside. She had learned to do this over the years, to go to some interior room and close the door while her body went on doing what was needed. She had done it during the long winter after her mother died. She had done it when Harold came home from card games in a mood that filled the house like smoke. She did it now. She would not cry. She refused to cry in front of these people. "She can read and write," Harold added, with the tone of a man listing the virtues of a horse. "She's good with figures, works hard, doesn't complain." "How old?" a man called from the crowd. 23, another voice. "What's the arrangement exactly? Service contract?" "Whatever the buyer needs." The woman who'd been whispering looked up at Mara with an expression that might have been pity, or might have been something worse than pity. The relieved recognition of a woman looking at someone whose situation could have been her own. Mara looked back at her steadily. The woman looked away. "Harold Whitmore." The voice that said it was not loud, but it cut through the ambient chatter the way a cold wind cuts through a room when someone opens a door. It had that quality. Sudden, definite, hard to ignore. "What exactly are you doing?" The crowd shifted, parted slightly, and the man who stepped forward was not what Mara expected. She'd anticipated Victor Crow. She'd seen him once or twice from a distance, big and well-dressed and wearing the particular confidence of a man who'd never had to wonder whether he could afford something. But this was not Victor Crow. This man was lean and tall, with the look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors, not because he had to, but because he preferred it. He wore no particular display of wealth, just clean clothes and good boots, and an expression that said he'd seen enough of the world to be hard to impress. He was somewhere in his mid-30s with dark hair going to gray at the temples and a face that had more angles to it than comfort. The kind of face that had been used hard and hadn't apologized for it. He was looking at the platform. At her. Not the way the others were looking. Not with interest in the transaction or the mild entertainment of a scene. He was looking at her the way you look at something that has gone badly wrong and is still going wrong while everyone watches. "That's Elias Vane," someone near Mara said, in the hushed tone people reserve for names that carry a specific weight in a specific place. She had heard the name. Mountain Ranch, north of Dust Creek, land that ran into high country most men wouldn't bother with, kept to himself, did his business in town and left without socializing. She didn't know more than that. Harold's jaw tightened. "That's not your concern, Vane." $40, Elias said. He looked at Mara, not at Harold. "Is that what you set for her?" "I said it's not your... I heard you say 40. Elias reached into his coat. He moved without hurry, without drama, like a man paying a bill. Like what he was doing was entirely unremarkable, except for the fact that it couldn't be. Not in any version of the world where Mara had any say over what happened next. He put bills on the platform step. "There it is. Now she's done with you." The crowd had gone quiet in the particular way that crowds go quiet when they realize they've stumbled into something that matters. Harold stared at the money. "Now wait a minute." "The debt she owed you is paid," Elias said. "If you want to dispute that in front of everyone here, go ahead." He looked around at the assembled faces, unhurried. I expect some of these folks would find that interesting. Harold looked at the crowd. The crowd looked back. A few people had the grace to look uncomfortable. Most just looked. Harold picked up the money. Mara stood on the platform and did not move, because she wasn't sure what moving meant yet, wasn't sure which direction was open to her, wasn't sure whether she was trading one trap for another or stepping out into open air. Elias looked up at her. "Miss," he said it plainly, the way you address someone. "You can come down now." She didn't move immediately. "Why?" He seemed to find this a reasonable question. "Because you're standing on a platform and you don't belong there, unless you want to stay." "I want to know what this costs me," she said. Something moved across his face. Not quite surprise, but close to it. "You want to have that conversation right here?" "I want to have it somewhere." "All right." He stepped back to give her room on the steps. "Come down, and we'll have it." She came down. They stood at the edge of the square while the crowd slowly lost interest and returned to its usual business with the slightly elevated energy of a group that had witnessed something it hadn't expected before noon. Harold had disappeared. She didn't watch him go. Elias Vane stood with his hands at his sides and his face open in the way of a man who had decided to be transparent about something and was waiting to see how it landed. "What do you want from me?" Mara asked. "Nothing," he said. She looked at him directly. She had dark eyes, people had sometimes told her, in a tone suggesting it wasn't a compliment. Too direct, too steady for comfort. She used them now. "Nobody pays $40 for nothing." "You're right," he said. "That wasn't nothing. That was..." He seemed to search for the word. "That was wrong. What was happening up there? I had the money to stop it, so I did." "And now?" "And now I don't know what you want to do," he said. "That's what I meant to ask." He paused. "What do you want to do?" She stared at him. The question landed in some place inside her that had been sealed for a long time, a place she didn't have easy access to, a room where things like want and choose and decide were stored unused from years of not needing them. "No one has ever asked me that," she said before she could stop herself. "I know," he said, and there was nothing smug about it, no satisfaction in being the one to finally ask. Just acknowledgement of a fact that was also, somehow, a quiet indictment of everyone else. Mara looked away, across the square, at the ordinary life of Dust Creek resuming around them, the conversations resuming, the business resuming, the town successfully not thinking too hard about what it had just watched happen. "I want to leave," she said finally. "This town. I don't want to be here anymore." Elias nodded once. "I've got a ranch north of here. You can have a room with a lock on the door. Work if you want it, time to figure out what's next if you need it." He met her eyes. "No strings I'm hiding, no agreement I'm not saying out loud." "Why would I believe that?" "You wouldn't," he said. "Not yet. But you'd have the key to your own door." A pause. "That's more than you had this morning." She thought about the gray dress she was wearing. She thought about the kitchen that still had her mother's mark on the doorframe from measuring Mara's height when she was 7 years old. She thought about Harold Whitmore's voice saying everybody walks away from this better, and feeling the absolute certainty that he had genuinely believed it, that this was the most honest he'd been with her in years, and how that was the worst part of it. Not that he was cruel, but that he wasn't. "All right," she said. She didn't know what all right meant exactly, but she said it. The ride north was long, and the wagon was not comfortable, and neither of them spoke much, which suited Mara fine because she had nothing she wanted to say, and she could not afford to think too hard yet about what she had agreed to or what she had left behind, or whether those were the same kind of loss. The ranch appeared out of the high country as the afternoon was thinning. Not dramatic, not a grand reveal, just a collection of buildings that had been built by someone who cared more about practical function than appearance, and had maybe softened toward appearance over time, grudgingly. A main house, a barn that was larger than the house, a bunkhouse at a distance, fences running into hills that disappeared in the afternoon haze. A boy of about 12 was sitting on the fence nearest the gate, and when the wagon came up he jumped down and ran toward them, calling out, "You were gone a long time, I was starting to—" He stopped when he saw Mara, looked at her with the direct, unself-conscious evaluation of a child. "Who's that?" "This is Miss Whitmore," Elias said, climbing down. "She'll be staying with us for a time. You'll treat her with respect." "What kind of respect?" "The regular kind, Tobias. The kind I raised you to know." Tobias squinted at her. He had Elias's jaw and dark hair and a gap in his front teeth from something recent. "Are you hurt?" he asked, with the bluntness of a child who had decided to ask the actual question instead of the polite one. Mara got down from the wagon without assistance. "No," she said. Tobias nodded, apparently satisfied. "Are you hungry?" "I made biscuits. They're not good, but there's a lot of them." The tightness in Mara's chest, which had been there since morning, which had been building for longer than morning if she was honest, which had been an ambient condition of her life for years, eased fractionally at that. "Yes," she said. "I'm hungry." The room was small. It had a window that faced east, a rope bed with a quilt on it that had been washed recently, and a wooden chair. The key was an actual key, iron, heavy, hanging from a peg by the door. Elias had showed her the room and said, "Lock's good. I've never had a copy made." And then he'd left her alone. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without doing anything. The window showed her the yard, the fence, the beginning of the hills. The light was going bronze-orange in the way of late afternoon in high country, that specific quality of western light that always struck her as too beautiful for the things that happened under it. She thought about the platform. She thought about standing there and not crying. She thought about Harold's voice. "You don't have anyone." And she sat with the fact that he had been right, that it was a true thing he'd said even if he'd used it wrong, and she let herself feel the weight of that truth without flinching away from it. She did not have anyone. She was in a stranger's house. She had $40 worth of debt attached to her name and a history she couldn't leave behind no matter how far north the wagon went. And she counted what she had practically: a room, a locked door, a key that was hers. She got up. She locked the door. She sat back down on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands, not crying, just holding herself together the way you hold something that's been cracked without wanting to see where the breaks are. After a while she heard, from somewhere in the house, the distant sound of Tobias Vane's voice informing someone, the biscuits, she thought, or possibly Elias, that they were wrong about something, and here was why. She almost smiled. She didn't, but she almost did. She did not sleep that first night. She lay awake and listened to the sounds of the ranch, the sounds of an unfamiliar place reassembling itself around her, the particular way a house settles at night when it belongs to someone else, the distant sound of horses, the wind coming down from the high country with that specific cold edge that meant elevation, meant distance from the valley below, meant somewhere different from where she'd been. She lay awake and she thought. Harold owed Victor Crow $300. Elias Vane had paid 40 of that. Paid it to Harold directly, which meant the rest of the debt still existed, which meant Victor Crow still had a claim on something in this equation. She didn't know what. She didn't know how it connected to her, or whether it did now that she was no longer in Harold's house, or what Crow would do when he found out his arrangement had been disrupted. She knew the name Victor Crow the way everyone in the valley knew it, as a presence more than a person, a name attached to land and money and the particular power that comes from owning enough of both that people get cautious around you out of pure instinct. She knew Harold was afraid of him. She had heard it in his voice through the wall. She wondered what Elias Vane's relationship with Victor Crow looked like, and whether she had walked out of one problem and into the edge of another. In the morning, she got up before dawn. Old habit. She found the kitchen without difficulty, started a fire in the stove, located the coffee, and had a pot going before Elias appeared in the doorway, looking like a man who had expected to make his own coffee and wasn't sure what to do with the situation. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted something to do." He sat down at the table. She handed him a cup. He took it and said nothing for a minute and then said, "How'd you sleep?" "I didn't." He didn't offer comfort about that or tell her it would get better. He just nodded like it was a reasonable piece of information about a reasonable situation. "Victor Crow," Mara said. "How much do you know about him?" Elias's expression didn't change exactly, but something in his posture shifted. The slight realignment of a man who has been waiting for a question to arrive and now sees it coming. "Why?" "Because Harold owed him $300 and you paid 40, and I want to know what kind of situation I've walked into," she said. "I'd rather know now than find out later." Elias set his cup down slowly. "Crow owns half the valley," he said. "The half he doesn't own, he's working on. Debt's his main tool. He lends money to people who need it, and when they can't pay, he takes their land." He paused. "Your father wasn't the first man to end up owing him money he couldn't repay." "And you?" she asked. "Crow and I have a history," Elias said, and he said it in the careful way people say things that are true, but are also the outline of something larger and more complicated that they're not ready to fill in yet. "Does that history put this ranch at risk?" "It might," he said. "I'm not going to lie to you about that." She looked at him across the kitchen table in the early light of a morning she hadn't slept toward, and she thought, he could have said no. He could have given me a simpler answer. "All right," she said. "All right?" "All right," she said again. "Then we need to understand what he's done." Elias looked at her, a long, considering look. Not the look of a man assessing value, not the look of a buyer or a judge or a spectator. The look of someone encountering something unexpected and choosing to keep looking at it until he understood it better. "You said you're good with figures," he said. "Better than good." He reached back and opened a drawer behind him and placed a ledger on the table between them. Old, worn, the kind of ledger that has been handled by multiple people over multiple years, its cover gone soft from use. "I've been trying to make sense of something in the Valley records for 3 years, he said. "I can't do numbers the way they need to be done. I can keep a ranch running, but patterns in paper." He shook his head. Mara pulled the ledger toward her. She opened the first page, and the tightness in her chest, that long-standing ambient tightness, became something different. Not gone, not resolved, but redirected. Focused. She turned the second page, and she began to understand, even in those first few minutes, even with just the first few columns of figures in front of her, that the situation in this valley was worse than anyone had named it yet. Tobias appeared in the kitchen doorway, barefoot, hair wild from sleep, looking at the two of them across a table covered in paperwork with an expression that managed to be both completely unsurprised and entirely awake. "There's no biscuits left," he said. I'll make more, Mara said, without looking up from the ledger. A silence. Okay, Tobias said. And he came and sat at the table without being invited. And outside, the high country morning was building itself up around the ranch the way mornings do. Gradually, without ceremony, the light changing the quality of everything it touched. And inside, a woman who had been sold the day before was reading a dead man's numbers and beginning to understand what they meant. She turned another page. She did not look up for a very long time. The ledger was not one document. That was the first thing Mara understood, and it took her the better part of the morning to understand it, working through the pages while Tobias ate the biscuits she'd made without commenting on them, except to say they were better than his, which she suspected was the highest compliment available in that household. The ledger Elias had given her was a copy, partial, incomplete, assembled from memory and scraps, of what appeared to be a much larger set of records. Someone had been trying to reconstruct something. The handwriting changed 3 times across its pages, which meant at least 3 people had contributed to it, and the entry stopped abruptly in the middle of a column with no explanation for why. She turned the last page and looked at the blank space where more numbers should have been. "Where did this come from?" she asked. Elias was at the other end of the table, working through something on his own. Ranch accounts, she thought, feed costs and supply orders. And he looked up with the expression of a man being pulled back from one problem into another. Pieces of it came from different places. Walt Deering gave me part of it before he left the valley. A woman named Cressida Holt sent me pages through her son. Rest of it, I put together myself from what I could remember of the county records before Crow got his man into the clerk's office. His man? New county clerk, name of Aldridge. Showed up about 4 years ago, started amending records. Elias set his pen down. Errors, he called them. Corrections to prior filings. Except every correction seemed to move a property line or change a debt date in a way that benefited Crow. Mara looked back at the ledger. These loan figures, the dates on some of them are wrong. Wrong how? This entry here. She turned the ledger so he could see it, pointing to a column near the middle. Someone recorded this loan as issued in March, but the repayment demand is dated January of the same year. You can't demand repayment 2 months before you issued the loan. Elias leaned forward and looked at where she was pointing. His jaw tightened. I didn't catch that. You weren't looking for it the right way, she said, not unkindly. You were reading it as a story. You have to read it as arithmetic. Numbers don't lie on their own, but they do tell you when someone else has lied. He was quiet for a moment. How many entries like that are there? She turned back to the pages. I found 4 in what you have here, but this is a fragment. If these patterns hold through the original records, she stopped. She turned back to an earlier page and checked something, then another page. Elias, how many families in this valley does Crow currently hold debt on? He thought about it. I know of at least 14, could be more. And how many of them are behind on payments? Most of them. And how many of them were behind before Crow adjusted the terms of their loans? The kitchen was quiet. Outside, something moved in the yard, one of the ranch hands crossing from the barn, and the sound of boots on packed earth came and went. That's the question, Elias said slowly. Isn't it? That's the question, Mara agreed. Tobias, who had been sitting quietly enough that both of them had forgotten he was there, said, So he made the debts impossible on purpose? Tobias, Elias said, go check the south fence. I already checked it. Check it again. Tobias looked at his father with the expression of a boy who knew exactly when he was being managed and resented it, but was going to comply anyway. He pushed back his chair, collected the remaining biscuit from the table, and left through the back door with the unhurried walk of someone demonstrating that they were leaving voluntarily, not because they'd been told to. Mara watched him go. He's smart. Too smart, Elias said, and I don't want him knowing how bad this is until I understand it better myself. He looked at the ledger. If what you're saying is right, I'm not saying it yet. I'm saying the fragment points in that direction. I need the real records. She paused. Or the records that existed before Aldridge started correcting them. Those are gone. Or he's got them somewhere. Not necessarily gone, Mara said. Copies exist, they have to. People who took out loans kept their paperwork. Farmers keep everything. They can't afford not to. If I could talk to some of the families Crow has debt on, see their original loan documents. That's going to require trust, Elias said. People in this valley are scared of Crow. They're not going to talk to a stranger about their private finances. They might talk to you. Some of them. He rubbed the back of his neck. Some of them blame me for not doing more. Others just, they've been afraid for so long, it's become a habit. He looked at her. You'd have to come with me. I can open the door, but I'm not the one who can read what they've got. Mara thought about what it meant to go back into the valley, to be visible again in a place where yesterday she'd stood on a platform. When? She asked. Soon. Before Crow figures out his arrangement with your father fell through. She nodded. She looked down at the ledger. She turned back to the first page, and she started again from the beginning, this time with a pencil and a fresh sheet of paper, making her own notes in the margins of her own record. She worked until noon without stopping. The first time she saw what the ranch actually was, not the buildings, not the land, but the daily reality of how Elias Vane kept it running, it surprised her. She'd expected order. He struck her as a man who ran tight operations, who liked things in their place, who kept a clean barn. She wasn't wrong about that. But what she hadn't expected was how much of the ranch ran on improvisation, on the daily renegotiation of what was possible given what you actually had, which was different on any given day from what you'd planned for. The south fence Tobias had been sent to check turned out to actually need checking. 2 posts had come loose in the night, and a section had gone down, and 2 of the horses had gotten into the upper pasture where they weren't supposed to be. She watched from the yard as Elias and Tobias and a ranch hand named Cutter worked to get the horses back and repair the fence. And she noticed the particular efficiency of people who have done this kind of problem-solving together long enough that they don't need to talk much. They just move, and the movements fit together. She also noticed Tobias, who was small for 12 but fast, who seemed to know exactly where to be without being told, who watched his father the way a boy watches someone he wants to understand completely. She thought about her own childhood, about the things she'd watched her father do, and she put it away. After the fence, Elias came back to the yard dirty and tired with a cut on his forearm from the wire that he wasn't paying attention to, and Mara said, "You're bleeding," and he looked at his arm like he'd forgotten it was there. "It's not bad," he said. "It'll get infected if you leave it." "I've had worse." "That's not an argument," she said, and went inside and found what she needed and came back out and cleaned and wrapped it, while he stood there with the particular patience of a man who has decided not to argue about something small, and she felt the strange intimacy of that, of being trusted with a small thing, of someone standing still for you without obligation. "Thank you," he said when she was done. "Don't mention it," she said. She meant it both ways. That evening after supper, Elias told her about the year he lost the north quarter of the ranch. He didn't plan to tell her. She could see that. It came out sideways, the way hard things do, attached to something else, starting as an explanation and becoming something more honest partway through. He'd been talking about Crow and the land patterns Mara had identified, and he said, "I've watched him do this for a long time. Watched him do it and not been able to stop it. North quarter of this ranch used to run another mile up into the high country. Good land. Crow got it 4 years ago through a disputed title claim." He stopped, his jaw tightened. "I fought it. Hired a lawyer from Billings. Lost anyway." Mara was quiet. "I had money, I had the land, I had a lawyer, and I still lost," he said. "Because Crow had Aldridge in the clerk's office and a judge in his pocket, and it didn't matter what the original deed said, because the original deed didn't exist anymore in any form the court would recognize." He looked out the kitchen window into the dark yard. "So I know what it's like to have something taken from you and stand there with nothing to show for it and have the whole apparatus of the law tell you it was legal." "Is that why you paid for me?" Mara said. The question landed in a small silence. "Partly," he said. He seemed to think about whether that was the whole answer. "I've watched Crow run a transaction on people for 4 years, watched him price people and situations and figure out how to move them to his advantage. And I watched your father walk you up to that platform, and He stopped. I couldn't watch another transaction. Not that one. Mara looked at her hands on the table. My father convinced himself it was practical. I know. He probably still does. I know that too, Elias said. She looked up at him. What happened to Tobias's mother? Another silence, different from the first. This one with weight in it. The weight of something that has been carried for a long time and become part of the body's daily sense of itself. She left, he said. When Tobias was 4. She didn't want the ranch, didn't want the isolation. He picked up his coffee cup, looked into it. I don't blame her. I should have understood sooner what she needed, and I didn't. He set the cup down. Tobias doesn't remember her much. Sometimes I think that's easier. Sometimes I think it's the hardest part. Mara didn't say anything, because there was nothing useful to say. They sat for a while in the way of two people who have exchanged honest things and are letting them settle. Then Elias said, I went to that square because I needed to talk to Silas about grain prices. I wasn't looking for... He made a gesture that encompassed everything since the morning. I wasn't looking for any of this. Neither was I, Mara said. Something shifted between them at that, and she wasn't sure what to call it. Recognition, maybe, the specific recognition of two people who have both had large, unexpected things land on them and are figuring out what to do with the weight. I'll go with you into the valley, she said, to talk to the families. I can do the numbers. You handle the doors. Deal, he said. Outside, the high country wind moved through the dark, and somewhere in the barn one of the horses shifted, and the small sounds of a working ranch at night settled around them without ceremony, without meaning anything except what they were. Victor Crow found out about Mara Whitmore within 3 days. She hadn't expected it to take that long, actually. Small territories have efficient information systems, and what happened in the square in Dust Creek was not a small thing by the standards of a valley where most events were. She was in the yard helping Tobias with a broken harness buckle. She was better with small mechanical things than she'd expected, had always been, her hands knowing how parts fit together the way her mind knew how numbers did. When a rider came up the road fast and pulled up at the gate and called for Elias. Elias came out of the barn. Message from Mr. Crow, the rider said. He was young, well-dressed in the way of men who work for wealthy employers, his horse too good for an errand boy. He requests Mr. Vane's presence in town this week, regarding a matter of mutual interest. Elias looked at the rider without expression. Tell Mr. Crow I'm busy. He said to tell you it concerns the woman you took from the square. Tell him the same thing, Elias said. The rider looked uncertain, the look of a young man who had been given a message to deliver and an expected response, and the expected response was not this. Mr. Crow said, I heard you, Elias said. I said, I'm busy. You can tell him that or not. Your choice. He turned back toward the barn. The rider stood at the gate for a moment longer, recalibrating, then wheeled his horse and rode back the way he'd come. Tobias watched him go. Is that going to be trouble? Probably, Elias said. How much? Tobias. I'm not a child, Tobias said, with a 12-year-old's absolute conviction. I know what Crow is. You think I don't hear things? What do you hear? I hear that he took the Deering property because Walt Deering couldn't make a payment that shouldn't have been due yet. I hear that the Holts left the valley because someone burned their barn and nobody could prove it was Crow's men. I hear that 2 other families are late on payments and scared about what happens next. Tobias met his father's eyes directly. That's what I hear. Elias looked at his son for a long moment. Then he said, Go tell Cutter we need to check the water tank on the north end. Tobias went, but he went slowly. Mara set down the harness buckle. He knows everything you don't want him to know. I know, Elias said. He's 12. He shouldn't have to. You can't protect him from the truth of where he lives, Mara said carefully. That's not protection, that's just delay. Elias looked at her with the expression of a man hearing a thing he already knew and was not ready to sit with yet. I know that too. For what it's worth, Mara said. He's not scared. He's paying attention. Those aren't the same thing. Elias said nothing. He walked back into the barn and she let him go because sometimes people needed to take a piece of honesty somewhere private before they were ready to respond to it. They went into the valley on a Wednesday, just the two of them, leaving Tobias with Cutter with the specific instructions that Cutter would later describe to Mara as 5 minutes of instructions I already knew delivered in a tone that suggested the barn might catch fire while he was gone. The first family they visited was the Garretts, a husband and wife named Thomas and June, who ran a small cattle operation about 6 miles south of Dust Creek. Thomas met them at the door with the wariness of a man who had been burned enough times by people arriving unannounced to have made a policy about it. "Elias," he said, not unfriendly, not warm, the tone of a man who has separated personal feeling from practical caution. "Thomas, this is Mara Whitmore. She's been helping me look at some of Crow's loan practices. We'd like to see your original loan documents, if you'd be willing." Thomas's eyes moved to Mara. He looked at her the way men who don't know what to do with capable women look at them. Not hostile, but searching for context for a category that fits. "Whitmore," he said. "Harold Whitmore's daughter?" "Yes," Mara said. Something crossed his face. "I heard what happened in town Saturday." "I imagine you did," Mara said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come in." June Garrett was in the kitchen, and she looked at Mara with an expression less complicated than her husband's. A direct assessment, woman to woman, that moved quickly from evaluation to something like welcome. "Sit down," she said. "You want coffee?" "Please," Mara said. The loan documents took June 20 minutes to find, because they were in a box under the bed in the back room, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, which was how you stored important papers when you lived somewhere that had a wet spring. She put them on the table in front of Mara without ceremony. Mara began reading. She had her notes from Elias's ledger with her, in a small leather folder she'd found in the desk in the study. She'd asked Elias whether she could use it, and he'd said yes in the distracted way of a man who didn't fully register what he was being asked, and then came looking for it 3 hours later and found her, which was how the writing arrangements got settled. Now she laid her notes beside the Garrett's papers and began to compare. Thomas and June sat at the table and waited. Elias sat across from them and talked about cattle prices, which was both a conversation and a kindness, giving them something normal to do while Mara worked. 15 minutes in, she found it. "June," she said, "your original loan was for how much?" $120, June said. "We needed to fix the well and replace and the repayment terms were what?" $8 a month, for 2 years. We'd been paying on time every month, never missed one. "Your payment due date," Mara said. "What day of the month?" "First. Always the first." Mara turned one of the documents toward her. "This document here, this is Aldridge's amendment to your loan record at the county clerk's office. He changed the due date to the 25th, which means every payment you made on the 1st of the month was 4 days late by the amended record." She paused. 4 days late every month means you've been accruing the late penalty for 18 months. Silence. "That's not what we agreed to," Thomas said. His voice had gone flat in the way of a man trying to contain something that wanted to be much louder. "No," Mara said. "It isn't. And you have proof of what you agreed to because you kept your original contract." She tapped the oilcloth wrapper. "This is why he keeps it tidy. Most people who lose their original documents have nothing to argue with. You kept yours." June looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at the document. His hands were on the table and his jaw was working like he was deciding whether to say the thing he was thinking. "How much do we actually owe?" he asked. Mara did the arithmetic. She did it twice to be certain. "With the correct terms applied and your payments counted accurately, you've been overpaying for 18 months. You don't owe Crow anything." She paused. "He owes you roughly $30 in returned overpayments." June made a sound that was not quite a laugh, more like something that wanted to be a sob and took a wrong turn. "That can't be right," Thomas said. "It's right," Mara said. Thomas looked at Elias. Elias looked back at him. Something passed between them. Not quite an understanding, but the early shape of one. "If we took this to the county clerk," Thomas started. "Aldridge would bury it," Elias said. "Federal authorities," Mara said. not county. If this pattern holds across all the families Crow has debt on, and I believe it does, then what he's done is fraud at a scale that goes beyond what a county clerk can paper over. She looked at her notes. But I need more documents. I need to see what he's done to every family in this valley, not just yours. And I need the originals, not the amended copies. Thomas and June looked at each other. Something moved between them, the kind of communication that lives in long marriages, in the accumulated shorthand of two people who have made hard decisions together. I know 3 families who might show you their papers, June said finally. If I tell them it's all right. If I tell them what you found here. I'd appreciate that, Mara said. What are you going to do with all of it? Thomas asked. Build something he can't take apart, Mara said. That's what I'm going to do. Thomas nodded, once, slow. All right, he said. They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon, and neither of them spoke for the first several miles because they were both sitting with what the morning had produced, which was larger and heavier and more complicated than Mara had expected, even though she'd expected something. 4 days, Elias said eventually. He moved the due date 4 days and destroyed 18 months of payments. He probably did the same thing to every loan in his portfolio, Mara said. Different amounts, different adjustments, always small enough that any single case looks like a bookkeeping dispute, but across 14 families. It's a system, Elias said. It's a system, she agreed. He built it over years, carefully, piece by piece. Aldridge in the clerk's office, a judge he can call on, men who know how to be intimidating without being actionable. She watched the road ahead. He's very good at it. He's been doing it a long time, Elias said. Before I came to this valley, I think. Some of this started before I arrived. Did he try it with you? A pause. He tried the title claim, lost some land, the loan angle. He never got the leverage. I don't carry debt if I can avoid it. He glanced at her. My father drilled that into me, said debt was the thing they used on people like us. People like us, Mara repeated. What did he mean by that? Elias was quiet for a moment in a specific way. The quiet of a person deciding how much to say and to whom. My father was a miner, he said. Company town. Everything you bought, everything you needed, came through the company store, on credit, at company prices. You could work 10 years and still owe more at the end than you started with. He kept his eyes on the road. He got out eventually. Cost him most of what he had. He told me, the minute you owe a powerful man money, you're already working for him, whether you know it or not. Mara thought about Harold's voice. I've made arrangements. The flat certainty of a man who had already handed himself over to a more powerful man and stopped thinking of it as a choice. Victor Crow found my father's version of that, she said. Whatever Harold needed, Crow had it, and then Harold owed him, and owing him meant— She stopped. Meant he'd do things he otherwise wouldn't, Elias said. He was scared, Mara said, and she was not defending Harold. She was just locating him accurately, because there was no point in understanding something wrong. He was scared, and he made a coward's choice, and dressed it up as practical. People do that. They do, Elias agreed. That doesn't mean I forgive him, she said. No, Elias said. It doesn't have to. They rode in silence for a while. The road climbed as they moved north, the high country coming back into view, the ranch still far ahead. June Garrett said she knew 3 families who might talk to us, Mara said. I want to see all of them. I want to see every original loan document in this valley. What I have is a pattern. What I need is proof so complete that no one can look away from it. That's going to take time, Elias said. Then we'd better start early tomorrow, she said. He looked at her sideways, and in the long, late light of the afternoon, the expression on his face was something she didn't have a name for yet. Something that might need time to name correctly. Like a word you haven't encountered before, and have to see used several times before you understand what it means. Mara, he said. What? You're not doing this because you owe me something, he said. You know that. You don't owe me anything. She thought about it honestly. I know, she said. That's not why. Then why? She watched the road. The way the valley spread out below them as they climbed, the small geometries of ranches and fields, and the thread of the creek running through it, all of it arranged under that impossible western sky, like a problem set out for someone to solve. Because he took from people who had almost nothing, she said, and he was careful about it. He planned it. He made it look like their fault. She paused. I know what it feels like to have the whole story told about you and have no say in what it says. I know what it feels like to stand somewhere with no way to prove the truth. She looked at Elias. I can prove the truth. With numbers. So I will. He said nothing. He didn't need to. They rode the rest of the way to the ranch without speaking, but it was not an empty silence. It was a silence with something in it. The specific weight of two people who have said enough honest things to each other in a short time that the quiet between them has started to mean something it didn't mean before. Tobias was at the gate when they arrived, waiting with the unconvincing nonchalance of a boy who had definitely been watching the road for a while. Cutter let me check the water tank, he said. I was right. The float valve's going. I'll look at it tomorrow, Elias said, climbing down. Mara, Tobias said, did you find anything? She swung down from her horse, looked at him, 12 years old, gap-toothed, sharp as a blade, standing in the last light of the day with mud on his boots from a valve he'd fixed while they were gone. Yes, she said. I found a lot. He held the gate for her. Good, he said, with the satisfaction of someone who had already decided things were going to go a certain way and appreciated confirmation. She walked through the gate into the yard of a ranch that was not hers, and whose future was uncertain, and whose residents she'd known less than a week, and the tightness in her chest that had lived there so long she'd stopped noticing it had changed into something else. Not gone, not resolved, but different, pointed, purposeful. She thought, there is work to do. She went inside to start on the next set of numbers before the light failed entirely. The next 10 days were the hardest work Mara had done in her life, and she had done a lot of hard work. They rode out every morning before the dew had dried, Elias and Mara together, sometimes with June Garrett's introduction in hand like a letter of safe passage, sometimes on the strength of Elias's name alone, sometimes on nothing except Mara's willingness to sit across a kitchen table from a frightened family and explain, quietly and without drama, what she'd found in the Garrett's papers and what she suspected existed in theirs. Some doors opened, some didn't. A man named Pruitt told them to get off his property and meant it, his hands shaking not from anger but from fear so long-standing it had become indistinguishable from his resting state. A widow named Clara Sims sat with them for 2 hours and showed them everything she had, and cried once, briefly, and then stopped crying and asked practical questions. A farming family named the Aldersons had burned their paperwork the previous winter, not from carelessness but from a calculated decision that having evidence was more dangerous than not having it, which was its own kind of testimony about what life in this valley had become. Each household was a different texture of the same despair. People who had worked land for years, who had borrowed carefully and repaid faithfully, who had watched the terms beneath them shift like sand in a current, and understood what was happening but had no language to name it in a way that anyone with authority would recognize. Mara named it. Carefully, clearly, with numbers. By the end of 10 days, she had original loan documents from 9 families. She had her own reconstructed records, built from memory and fragments, and the pieces Elias had assembled years earlier, cross-referenced against every original document she'd seen. She had a pattern so consistent it could not be coincidental. Due date manipulations, interest rate adjustments inserted into records after the fact, penalty clauses that had not existed in the original contracts and had been quietly added to the county copies. She had it laid out across the kitchen table in stacks that Tobias had been instructed not to touch, a rule he observed with the specific scrupulousness of a boy who wanted to be trusted with more. What she did not have yet was a way to get it to someone who could act on it. Federal Land Office, Elias said one evening, standing at the table looking at the stacks. Helena, there's an agent there, a man named Garrett Birch. He came through the valley 2 years ago asking questions about property irregularities. Crow shut that down fast. Birch went back to Helena, and nothing came of it. Ooh, why nothing? Because at that point nobody would talk. Crow put the word out quietly that anyone who spoke to the federal agent would find their debt called in immediately. He looked at her. People made the calculation. Can we reach Birch directly? Bypass the county entirely? I can send a letter, whether he comes, whether he acts. Elias shook his head. I don't know. He might decide it's not worth another trip into hostile territory. Then we give him something he can't ignore, Mara said. She looked at the stacks. What I have here is a case, a real one. If I write it up properly, not a complaint, not a grievance, but an actual documented analysis showing the pattern across 9 families with original contracts as evidence, that's not a thing a federal agent can file away and forget. How long to write it? 2 days, she said. Maybe 3 if I'm careful. She was careful. It took 3. She was on the 2nd day of writing when Victor Crow came to the ranch himself. She heard the horses from the study, 4 of them, which was not a social call, and she heard Tobias's voice from the yard, loud and deliberately loud in the way of a boy making sure someone inside could hear what was happening outside. She got up from the desk and moved to the window. Crow was not what she'd imagined, which bothered her in a specific way, because she'd prepared for the version in her head and now had to adjust quickly. He was older than she'd expected, mid-50s, with white at the temples and the broad, settled build of a man who had spent years being physically substantial and had not entirely lost it. He was well-dressed, without ostentation, the kind of expensive that doesn't announce itself but is visible to anyone who knows what they're looking at. He had a face that was not unpleasant. That was what surprised her most. He looked like someone's respected uncle. He looked like a man who sat on town councils and donated to causes and whose name went on the cornerstones of buildings. He had 2 men behind him, and they looked like their job, which was to look like their job. Elias came out of the barn. She could see his posture from the window, squared, deliberate, the posture of a man who had known this was coming and had decided in advance how he was going to stand for it. She went to the door and opened it, staying inside the frame. Elias, Crow's voice carried easily across the yard. Good to see you. Victor, Elias said. I didn't know you were coming. I sent a message. You sent a rider. I told the rider I was busy. Crow smiled. It was a patient smile, the smile of a man who considers other people's resistance a temporary condition. I thought the matter was important enough to come in person. His eyes moved to the doorway where Mara stood, and something in his expression shifted. Not dramatically, just a recalibration, the slight adjustment of a man encountering a variable he hadn't fully accounted for. Miss Whitmore? She said nothing. I was concerned about you, he said. After what happened with your father, that was an unfortunate situation. Was it? She said. Harold made some poor decisions. I want you to know that what he did had nothing to do with me. The debt he owed was legitimate, but the manner in which he chose to address it. He shook his head with the practiced sorrow of a man distancing himself from consequences he'd engineered. That was Harold's choice. $300, Mara said. At what interest rate, Mr. Crow? A small pause. The standard rate. What rate is that? Miss Whitmore, I didn't come here to discuss. What rate did you charge Harold Whitmore? She said. On a $300 loan. Elias was watching her from across the yard. She couldn't read his expression clearly from this distance, but he hadn't moved, and that felt deliberate. Crow looked at her with the patient expression reorganized slightly. Not quite the same as before. Something behind it was paying closer attention now. You've been busy, he said. Not a question. I've been working, she said. I've heard. He turned back to Elias. Elias, I came to make a reasonable offer. I understand Miss Whitmore has been gathering documents from families in the valley. I'd like her to stop. She doesn't work for me, Elias said. I can't tell her to stop. Then I'd like you to encourage her to stop. Still the patient tone. Still the reasonable manner. Some of these families have outstanding debts that are past due. I've been lenient. I would prefer to continue being lenient. But if there's going to be a campaign of document collection, he said it with a particular delicacy, like the phrase tasted bad, then I may need to revisit that leniency. That sounds like a threat, Elias said. It's an observation, Crow said, about cause and effect. Mara stepped down from the doorway into the yard. She walked across the packed earth toward the 2 men, not fast, not dramatic, just deliberately, the way you walk when you've decided to be in a place and you're going to be in it. Mr. Crow, she said, stopping about 10 feet away from him, I want to ask you something directly. He looked at her with the indulgent expression of a man prepared to be patient with someone who doesn't understand what they're dealing with. Go ahead. The Garrett loan, she said. Original due date was the 1st of the month. The county record currently says the 25th. Did you authorize that change, or did Aldridge make it independently? A silence. Not a long one, but the kind of silence that has weight. I don't know what you're referring to, Crow said. The Sims loan, she continued. Original interest rate 4% annually. Current county record says 7. The Alderson loan, they burned their copies, so I only have the county record, which shows a penalty clause that I have 4 witnesses willing to testify was not in the original contract. She paused. That's 3 families. I have 9. Would you like me to continue? One of the men behind Crow moved slightly, a small shift of weight, the kind of unconscious physical adjustment that happens when a situation changes and the body registers it before the mind catches up. Crow's face had gone still. Not angry. That was what she noticed. Not angry the way she'd expected. More like a man looking at a board game and realizing the other player has made a move he didn't see coming and is now working out whether it's recoverable. You're a young woman with some paperwork, he said quietly. What do you think you're going to do with it? Send it to Garrett Birch at the Federal Land Office in Helena, she said, along with a written analysis of the pattern across all 9 families, with original contracts attached as evidence. Something moved behind his eyes. Birch is thorough, she said. I've read his prior inquiry correspondence. He knows what to look for. He just needed someone to organize it for him. You've read his... Crow stopped, started again. How did you get federal inquiry correspondence? From the family that received it 2 years ago when he came through the valley, she said. They kept it. People in this valley keep their paperwork, Mr. Crow. You just didn't realize how much of it they'd kept. The yard was quiet. Behind Crow, the 2 men were very still. Behind Mara, she could feel the ranch, the barn, the house, the fence lines running into the hills, like a thing with weight against her back. Crow looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Elias. You brought this into your house, he said. She walked in herself, Elias said. You'll regret the association. I already had associations you regret, Elias said. You took land over one of them. I'm still here. Crow turned his horse. He didn't say anything else. No threats, no escalating rhetoric, no grand gesture. He just turned, and his men turned with him, and they rode out of the yard at the same pace they'd come in, unhurried, like a man who has options and is deciding between them. Mara stood in the yard and watched them go. After a while, Tobias appeared from the side of the barn where he had definitely not been hiding and said, Did you just tell him what we have? Yes, Mara said. Why? Now he knows. He already knew something was happening, she said, and I needed to know how he'd react when he knew I had enough to name it specifically. She turned back toward the house. He didn't threaten us directly. He'll go think first. That means we probably have a few days. A few days for what? Tobias asked. To finish the report and get it to Helena before he decides what to do next. Tobias looked at his father. She does this on purpose, he said. The calm thing. It's on purpose. I know, Elias said. He was looking at Mara with that expression again, the one she hadn't named yet. Get back to the barn, Tobias. Tobias went, without argument this time. She worked through most of that night, and Elias sat in the kitchen and did not tell her to stop, which she took as a form of partnership. He made coffee at midnight and put a cup beside her without asking whether she wanted one, and she drank it and kept writing. At some point around 2 a.m, she looked up and said, Tell me about your father. Elias looked up from the account book he'd been using as a reason to stay awake. My father. You said he was in a company mine. What happened to him? He got out, Elias said. I told you. What happened after he got out? Elias was quiet for a moment. He homesteaded in Wyoming, had a good run for about 4 years. Then bad winters, bad prices, and he'd borrowed against the operation and couldn't make the payments. Lost the homestead. He paused. That's when he really drilled the debt thing into me, after we lost the Wyoming land. He blamed himself, Mara said. He blamed everyone, Elias said. Himself first, then the bank, then the weather, then the economy, and then back to himself. He wasn't consistent about it. He shifted in his chair. He wasn't a consistent man. He was a good one, but not consistent. Where is he now? Dead, 8 years ago. Heart. I'm sorry, Mara said. He saw the ranch before he went, Elias said. Saw that I'd built something that seemed to matter to him. He looked at the table. I don't know if it made up for the Wyoming land. I don't know what makes up for what. I think that's one of those questions that doesn't resolve. Mara looked at him across the kitchen table, the papers spread between them, the lamp burning low. My mother worked herself to death in that house, she said. Literally, she had a chest illness for 2 years and kept working because there was no one else to work, and she died on a Tuesday in November, and Harold went back to what he was doing by Wednesday. She said it without particular inflection. I don't think he meant to be cruel. I think she just wasn't loud enough in his life for her absence to register the way it should have. Elias said nothing. I spent 3 years after that keeping that house running and telling myself it was temporary, she said. That I'd figure out how to leave. Save money, find work somewhere else, something. She straightened the paper in front of her. I didn't save anything. He spent it. And then I stopped thinking about leaving because thinking about it without being able to do it was worse than not thinking about it. Until, Elias said. Until, she agreed. She went back to writing. He went back to the account book. The lamp burned down and he replaced the oil without asking, and she worked until the first bird started outside the window, and then she put the pen down and looked at what she had. 41 pages of organized evidence. 9 families. Pattern analysis spanning 4 years. Original contracts indexed and referenced throughout. Birch's prior inquiry correspondence used as a framework, showing exactly how the current evidence answered the questions his first visit had left open. She picked it up and held it, feeling its weight. 41 pages was not heavy, but what was in it was. It's done, she said. Elias looked up. He looked at the pages. When can we get it to Helena? Cutter should ride tomorrow, she said. Today, in a few hours. She rubbed her eyes. Birch needs to receive it before Crow has time to... The window exploded inward. Not the glass, the shutter, which had been latched, which was unlatched now by the force of something thrown against it, and the thing that came through it was not large, but it landed burning on the kitchen floor, and Mara had exactly 1 second to understand what she was looking at before Elias was already moving. Get out, he said. Not loud. The absolute absence of panic in his voice was the most frightening thing she had heard. Door, now! She grabbed the papers. He grabbed her arm and they went through the back door into the yard, and the first thing she saw was that the barn was already on fire, the orange light pouring out between the boards on the east side, and she thought of the horses and heard Tobias yelling somewhere in the dark. Tobias! Elias's voice, controlled, but underneath it something that was not controlled, the voice of a father in the dark. Here, the horses, I can... Leave the horses, get to the fence. Dad, now, Tobias. The next 20 minutes were not something she could reconstruct cleanly afterward. She remembered specific things, the weight of 41 pages in her hand, held against her chest like something she'd carry out of a burning building because she would and did. The sound of horses, at least 2 of them got clear, she heard them, and Cutter's voice in the dark managing them. The pump at the well, and the uselessness of 2 people with buckets against what the barn had become. Elias's face in the firelight when he turned and looked at what was left, and understood that some of it wasn't coming back. Tobias was at the fence, unhurt, furious in the way of a 12-year-old who has been kept at a distance from something terrifying and hasn't decided yet whether he's relieved or insulted. The barn went down before dawn. The house didn't catch. The kitchen shutter burned and a wall was scorched, but Cutter got water on it fast enough. The barn was gone. When it was over, Elias stood at the edge of the ruin and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Mara stood beside him. She still had the papers. "The horses," she said. "4 got out," Cutter said, "somewhere behind them." "Lost 2." Elias made a sound, small, barely audible. She felt it in her chest rather than heard it, the specific frequency of a man absorbing a loss that has a lot of other losses packed inside it. "This was a message," Mara said quietly. "I know what it was," he said. "He moved faster than I expected. He's been doing this a long time." Elias turned from the ruin. In the early gray light, his face was ash-streaked and very tired, and something else, something settled, the look of a man who has been pushed past the point where there's anything left to deliberate about. "Cutter." "Boss." "Get the gray ready. You're riding to Helena today. Not this afternoon. Today." "Yes, sir." Mara handed Elias the papers. He needs to understand what to say when he delivers it, that it's time-sensitive, that the man who built this evidence is at active risk. "I'll tell him." She looked at the papers in his hands. 41 pages that she'd spent 3 days and 1 night producing. The things she'd built out of numbers and other people's kept documents, and the stubborn conviction that truth was something you could organize into a form no one could dismiss. "If Birch doesn't come," she started. "He'll come," Elias said. "But if he doesn't, Mara." He said her name the way you say something when you want a person to stop for a moment and let it be what it is. "He'll come." She looked at him. The firelight was dying now. The barn collapsed into itself, the light going from orange to the red-gray of dying coals. Somewhere a horse moved. Tobias's voice, talking to Cutter, practical and too steady for a boy who had watched the barn burn from a fence 20 feet away. "He's all right," Elias said, following her eyes to Tobias. "He's tougher than I want him to be." "That's probably your fault," she said. He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it. "Probably." Crow's men came back 2 days later, not to burn anything. This time it was 3 of them, mid-morning, and they came with a document, a formal legal notice, the county seal on it, Aldridge's signature at the bottom, informing Elias Vane that his property was subject to review due to an outstanding dispute regarding the original homestead filing. Mara read it at the kitchen table. She read it twice. "This is the title claim," she said. "He's starting the same process he used on the North Quarter." "I know," Elias said. "It's retaliation for the report to Birch." "I know that too." "Can he actually—" She stopped. Read it again. "Elias, this cites an amendment to the original filing from 1881. The ranch was established in 1879. "I know." He's claiming an amendment was filed 2 years after the fact that supersedes your original claim. He got Aldridge to backdate it, Elias said. "I assume." He said it with the exhausted practicality of a man who has stopped being surprised by the specific forms that bad things take. "We need to prove the amendment was fraudulent," Mara said. "The original homestead filing. Where is your copy?" "Lockbox. Under the floor in the study." "Get it." He got it. She compared it to the county record cited in the legal notice. The original filing was clean, clear, entirely consistent with what any legitimately filed homestead claim from 1879 looked like. The 1881 amendment cited in the notice was a different document entirely. Different paperweight, she was nearly certain, though she couldn't be definitive about that from a copy. But the language in it was wrong in ways that mattered. The phrasing in the amendment used terms that hadn't been standard in federal land filings until 1884 at the earliest. "This wasn't written in 1881, she said. "The language is wrong. Someone wrote this more recently and backdated it." Elias looked at what she was pointing at. "You're sure?" "I know what 1881 land filings look like," she said. "I read 3 of them in the county records 2 weeks ago. This isn't one." She wrote it down, added it to her notes. The notes had a name now in her mind, the second file, because she had begun to understand that what she was building was not 1 document but 2. The first was the case against Crow for what he'd done to the Valley families. The second was the case against Aldridge for what he'd done to the records. They were connected but distinct, and Birch would need both. She wrote a follow-up letter that afternoon to be sent to Helena separately, documenting the legal notice and her analysis of the fraudulent amendment. She gave it to Cutter, who was still in the valley. He'd been delayed by a problem with one of the horse's shoes, and he rode that same evening. Crow's men returned the next morning to collect Elias's formal response to the legal notice. Mara answered the door. The man who'd delivered the notice was there again, middle-aged, flat eyes, the careful manner of someone who does this kind of work for a living and has separated himself from the moral content of it. He looked at her with mild surprise. "I'm here for Mr. Vane," he said. "Mr. Vane asked me to speak for him on this matter," she said. His response to the notice is that the amendment it references is fraudulent, and he has documented evidence to that effect, which has already been forwarded to the Federal Land Office in Helena. She looked at him steadily. "You can tell Mr. Crow that." The man looked at her for a moment. He looked at the document in his hand. "He's not going to like that answer," he said, with the odd candor of someone slipping out of their professional mode for just a second. "I expect not," Mara said. He rode away. She closed the door and leaned her back against it and let out a long breath that she hadn't realized she'd been holding. From the kitchen, Tobias's voice. "Did you just tell him to tell Crow to get lost?" "Roughly," she said. "In nice words." "There are times for nice words," she said. This was one of them. She heard the scrape of his chair. "He's going to come himself next time," Tobias said. "Crow. He's going to come back himself because the messages aren't working." She straightened from the door. 12 years old, she thought. He was 12 years old, and he understood this better than most grown men would have. "You're probably right," she said. "So what do we do?" She walked to the kitchen doorway and looked at him, at the gap-toothed face that was starting to lose its childhood roundness, at the dark eyes that were his father's, at the set of his jaw that was something he'd built himself through whatever the last several years of his life had been. "We go to the town," she said, "before he comes back to us." Tobias stared at her. "You want to go to Dust Creek?" "I want to go before Birch arrives, while Crow thinks he still has time to manage this quietly." She came into the kitchen and sat down. "He's spent 4 years making this valley afraid of him, but afraid people are not the same as people who've decided. And when you show them what was done to them, not just tell them, but show them, with numbers, with their own documents, with proof they can hold in their hands." She stopped. She looked at the table. "What?" Tobias said. "People need to see it to believe it," she said. "I need to bring the evidence to them, not just to Birch, to the people in this valley, to the town. Because when Birch arrives, he's going to need more than papers. He's going to need people who are willing to stand up and say, yes, that's what happened to us. Yes, that's my signature on the original contract. Yes, I kept my copy." She looked at Tobias. "Your father said you hear things. Do you know of people in Dust Creek, not just the families we've talked to, but the town itself? Do they know what Crow's been doing?" "They suspect," Tobias said. "Same way you know a game's rigged, but you can't prove it." He paused. "People are afraid of what happens if they say it out loud." "What if someone else said it first?" Mara said. Tobias was quiet. "What if they'd already heard it from someone who stood up in the middle of their town and said it clearly, with evidence, and didn't flinch when she said it?" She stopped, listened to what she'd just said. "They watched me stand on a platform and not cry. Whatever they thought of it, they watched it. They remember it." From outside came the sound of Elias in the yard talking to one of the remaining horses, that low particular voice he used with animals, unhurried, present, like a man who had learned that some things only respond to patience. "He's not going to like this plan," Tobias said. "He'll understand it," Mara said. "That's not the same thing." "No," she said, "it isn't." She got up because there was more writing to do and she needed to do it tonight, while she still had the clarity of knowing exactly what she wanted to say and why she wanted to say it and to whom. She needed to write the speech she was going to give in Dust Creek, in the square where she'd stood on a platform 3 weeks ago and not cried. She sat down at the desk. She picked up the pen. She started with the numbers because that was where certainty lived, and then she worked outward from there into everything else, into the names of the families, the amount stolen, the years it had taken, the meticulous patience of a man who had built his empire one small adjustment at a time and trusted that no one would ever have the time or the skill or the sheer stubborn refusal to sit down and prove what he'd done. He had miscalculated. Outside, the evening was settling over the high country, the light going gold and then amber, and then the specific deep blue of mountain dusk. And somewhere in the ruins of the barn, the last of the day's heat was rising from the ash. She wrote until her hand ached. She did not stop. Elias did not like the plan. She had expected that. What she hadn't expected was the specific shape of his objection, which was not what she'd braced for, not it's too dangerous or you don't understand what Crow will do, but something quieter and more honest than that. You don't owe these people anything, he said. They were at the kitchen table, the speech she'd written between them, and he'd read it twice without speaking, and now he was looking at it with the expression of a man who understood what it was and wasn't sure how to argue against it. The families we talked to, maybe. But the town. Mara, these are the same people who stood in that square and watched. I know, she said. They didn't help you. I know that too. So why? Because it's not about them owing me, she said, or me owing them. It's about what's true and whether it gets said. She looked at the pages. Crow built this on silence, on people knowing something was wrong and not being able to prove it, and on the ones who could see it not saying it out loud. If I go to Helena with 41 pages and Birch comes and nobody in this valley is willing to stand in front of him and confirm it, he can shelve it. Call it a documentation dispute. Say the evidence is circumstantial. It's not circumstantial, Elias said. The fraud is in the records themselves. Then make me the argument a lawyer makes against that, she said. Because Crow will have one. Elias was quiet. He'll say the records were updated in good faith. He'll say the original contracts were informal and the county copies represent the legally binding terms. He'll say the families signed documents they didn't fully understand and the fault lies with their own ignorance. She paused. And if the families themselves aren't there to refute that, if it's just paper against paper, maybe he wins. Not certainly, but maybe. Elias picked up the speech, set it down again. You said you'd stand up in that square. Yes. The same square where... Yes, she said. That square. He looked at her. The kitchen lamp was between them, and in its light his face was complicated in a way she'd gotten used to reading by now. The particular set of his mouth when he was working through something and hadn't arrived yet. The small tension around his eyes when he was trying to separate what he felt from what was practical. I don't want you to get hurt, he said. Not it's dangerous or Crow will retaliate, just that, plainly. It landed differently than she'd expected. I know, she said. After a moment, but I'm going. He looked at her for another beat. Then he nodded, once. Then I'm going with you. I assumed, she said, and Tobias stays here with Cutter. He'll argue. He will, Elias agreed, and he'll stay anyway. Tobias argued for 22 minutes the following morning, which Mara thought showed considerable stamina for a 12-year-old confronting a decision that had already been made. He made several reasonable points. That he was old enough, that he knew Dust Creek better than either of them, that leaving him behind was treating him like a child. And Elias listened to all of them with the patience of a man who has made up his mind and is willing to let the argument run its course before confirming it. You're staying, Elias said when Tobias finished. That's not fair, Tobias said. No, Elias agreed. It isn't. Tobias looked at Mara. You could convince him. I could try, she said. I won't. Why not? She looked at him. The gap-toothed face, the jaw set in frustration, the eyes that were going to make someone think very hard someday. Because if something goes wrong in Dust Creek, someone needs to be here who knows where everything is and can make decisions. That's not a small job. She paused. That's you. Tobias looked at her. The frustration in his face moved through something else, recognition, maybe, the reluctant satisfaction of being taken seriously even while being managed. If something goes wrong, he said slowly, what do I do? You know where the second copy of the report is, she said, the one in the lockbox. Under the floor in the study, yes. If we're not back in 2 days, you get that to Cutter, and Cutter rides to Helena. He doesn't stop. He doesn't wait. She held Tobias's eyes. Can you do that? A silence. Tobias looked at his father, then back at her. Yes, he said. He didn't argue any more after that. They rode into Dusk Creek on a Thursday morning, which was not a market day and not a weekend, which meant the town would be at its ordinary working level. People with business to conduct, not people gathered for entertainment or spectacle. She had chosen the day deliberately. She didn't want spectators. She wanted people with enough of their regular lives intact that they could think. The square looked smaller than it had 3 weeks ago, or maybe she was just different. The platform was still there. It served various civic purposes, she understood, was not built for the specific event she'd stood on it for. Someone had stacked lumber against its side. A dog was sleeping under it in the morning shadow. She and Elias tied their horses at the rail in front of the hardware store and stood for a moment in the early street. How do you want to do this? He asked. I need someone to get people here, she said. Not an announcement, just talk. The way news moves in a town. June Garrett is staying with her sister on the south end of town this week, she told me. If you find her and tell her what we're doing, she'll handle the rest. And while I do that, I'll go see Harold, she said. Elias looked at her. Are you sure about that? No, she said. But I'm going to do it. He went to find June Garrett. Mara walked to the north side of town, to the building where Harold Whitmore had been renting a room since losing the house to a debt called in by Crow the previous fall. She'd learned this from June, who knew everything about everyone in the way of women who have been in a community long enough to be its memory. She stood outside the door for a moment, then she knocked. Harold opened it. He looked older than she remembered from 3 weeks ago, which didn't make sense given the time. But sometimes people age in the interval between the last way you saw them and the first time you see them after something has changed. He was in his undershirt, and his hair was uncombed, and he smelled like stale coffee, and the particular closed-room staleness of a man who hasn't been going outside much. He stared at her. Mara, he said. Harold, she said. A long pause. He stepped back from the door, which she took as an invitation, and she came in and stood in the small room. A bed, a table, 2 chairs, a window facing the alley, and looked at the life that remained after the calculations he'd made. I didn't know, he started. I'm not here about what happened in the square, she said. I need your testimony. He blinked. My what? Victor Crow forced you into that arrangement. He held your debt over you and gave you no options. I need you to say that, in public, today. Harold's face went through several things in quick succession. Surprise, defensiveness, fear, and then something slower and more complicated underneath all of those. I can't. You can, she said. I have documentation of what he's done across this valley. 9 families, fraudulent loan records, manipulated due dates, a county clerk in his pocket who amended official filings to steal land legally. She looked at him steadily. He did the same thing to you. Your debt, whatever you owed him, I'd be willing to bet the terms changed after you signed. Harold sat down on the edge of the bed. He put his hands on his knees and looked at them. He changed the payment schedule, he said. About a year in. Said it was a billing correction. I didn't have the original paperwork anymore. I'd lost it in the move. I know, she said. That's how he works. He waits until people don't have their originals anymore. Harold looked up at her. If I say something, he'll come after you, she said. Probably. He doesn't have much left to take from you, but he'll find something. She paused. I'm not going to tell you it's safe. It isn't. Then why would I? Because you owe me something, she said. Not loudly, not with heat, just as a fact, the way you state a figure in a column. Not money, not anything you can pay back directly, but you owe me something, Harold, and this is the shape it comes in. He looked at her for a long time. She watched the calculation run behind his eyes. The same calculation she'd watched him run his whole life. The weighing of cost and return, the arithmetic of a man who had learned to measure everything in terms of what it would cost him. She watched him come out somewhere different. What do you need me to say? He asked. Man. By mid-morning, there were maybe 40 people in the square. Not a crowd. Not the kind that had gathered 3 weeks ago out of curiosity and free time. These were specific people. June Garrett had moved through the town with the efficiency of a woman who knew which doors to knock on and what to say at them. Thomas Garrett was there, and Clara Sims, and 2 of the other families Mara had interviewed, and a group of men from the hardware store who had come out initially to see what was happening and had stayed when June Garrett told them what it was. The woman who had stood next to her on the day of the platform, the one who had whispered to the man beside her and then looked away when Mara caught her eye, was standing near the back of the group, a little apart, not quite committing. Elias stood to the side. He had not asked her if she wanted him to speak first, to introduce her, to manage the crowd. He seemed to understand, without her saying it, that this was not a thing he should manage. He was there. That was what she needed from him. She stood in front of the platform, not on it, because standing on it would have been the wrong thing. Too theatrical, too much an echo of what she was trying to replace. She stood in front of it, on the ground, at the same level as everyone else. She let the crowd settle. Then she said, 3 weeks ago, I stood on this platform because my father put me here. You were in this square that day, some of you, and you watched. I'm not angry about it anymore. She paused. I understand why people watch instead of acting when they're not sure what they're seeing. I want to tell you what you were seeing. She had her papers. She did not refer to them yet. She knew what was in them well enough to speak without them. Victor Crow has been stealing from this valley for 4 years, she said. Not in ways you could see from the outside. Not in ways that looked like stealing. He lent money to families who needed it. The Garretts, the Simses, the Aldersons, 6 other families whose names some of you know, and then he changed the terms after they signed. Not the original contracts, the county records. He has a man in the clerk's office who amended official filings to change due dates, interest rates, and penalty terms. So when families paid faithfully on the terms they'd agreed to, they were legally late on the terms they hadn't agreed to. She held up the papers. This is the documentation. 9 families. Original contracts compared to amended county records. The pattern is the same across all of them. The square was quiet in a way that was different from ordinary quiet. It was the quiet of people holding still because they were taking something in and needed the stillness to do it. What he did to these families, he did to my father, she said. Harold Whitmore's debt was real, but the payment schedule changed a year after he signed. He'd lost his original paperwork. He had no way to argue, and when the debt he couldn't legitimately owe became impossible to pay, Crow gave him options. Her voice remained even. My father made a terrible choice. He'll tell you that himself. Harold was at the edge of the gathering. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something he wasn't sure was solid, but he was there. When she said it, he looked up and met her eyes, and then looked back at the ground, and he did not leave. I'm not telling you this because I want your sympathy, Mara continued. I'm telling you because a federal land agent is coming from Helena. He received 41 pages of documented evidence 4 days ago. When he arrives, he is going to need people who are willing to say, in front of an official authority, yes, this happened to me. Yes, I have the original documents. Yes, I can confirm what this evidence shows. She looked at the crowd. He can't shelve testimony. He can't amend a room full of people who were there. A man near the middle of the group said, Crow's going to fight it. Yes, she said. He will. He has money, and he has lawyers, and he has whatever he has left in the county apparatus. He's very good at this. She paused. But he built this on the assumption that people wouldn't organize, that the fear was too distributed, too individual, too isolated for anyone to assemble the whole picture. She lifted the papers slightly. He was wrong about that. Silence. Then June Garrett's voice from the crowd. What do you need us to do? Keep your original documents safe, Mara said. Make copies if you can. When Birch arrives, be willing to speak. That's all. Be willing to say what happened in your own words to a man who has the authority to act on it. Another voice from the back, a man she didn't recognize. And if Crow comes after us before this federal man gets here, She looked toward the voice. Then you've already been coming after each other for 4 years without the evidence to fight back, she said. Now you have it. That's a different situation. It wasn't a perfect answer. She knew it wasn't. But it was an honest one, and in her experience, honest, imperfect answers moved people more than perfect false ones. The woman from 3 weeks ago, the one who'd looked away, stepped forward slightly. Not dramatically, just enough. I'm Margaret Hollis, she said. My husband and I have a property on the East Road. Crow has been claiming a right-of-way through the South Field that was never in our deed. She looked at Mara. I have the original deed. Then bring it when Birch comes, Mara said. Margaret Hollis nodded once and stepped back to where she'd been, but she was standing differently now and was not apart from the group, just in it. Sashkin. Victor Crow arrived at the square 40 minutes later. She had expected him sooner, actually. The town's information systems worked in both directions, and she'd known when she started talking that word would reach him. The 40 minutes suggested he'd taken time to consider his approach, which was its own kind of information. He came alone, which surprised her. No men behind him, no formal accompaniment, just Victor Crow on horseback, riding into the square with the unhurried confidence of a man who believes that his presence is itself an argument. He dismounted, looked at the crowd which had held. More people had arrived in the last 40 minutes, drawn by the same word of mouth that had reached Crow. He looked at Mara. He looked at Elias. Miss Whitmore, he said, I heard you were making a speech. I was, she said. I finished. Now I'm just standing here. He walked toward her slowly, stopping about 8 feet away. He was very good at this, at controlling space, at using his physical presence like a component of an argument. She had watched him do it in the ranch yard, and now she was watching him do it here, and she made herself stand at the same level of stillness she would have given a column of numbers that needed reading. You've made accusations today that are going to be very difficult to substantiate, he said, pitched for the crowd to hear. The county records are official documents. You're asking people to trust handwritten originals over official filings. No, she said. I'm asking them to trust their own signatures. She turned to the crowd. Thomas Garrett, your original loan contract. Who signed it? Thomas Garrett's voice from the crowd. My wife and I. And the county record that supersedes it. Did you sign that one? No, Thomas said. Never saw it until Mara showed it to us. Clara Sims, Mara said. Same question. Clara. Only signed one thing, the original. Never signed anything after. She let that sit. Then she turned back to Crow. Official documents require authorized signatures to amend, she said. None of these families signed the amended records. Their signatures are only on the originals. She held up the report. 41 pages, 9 families. The pattern is consistent enough that it's not a series of clerical errors. And a federal agent has already received this documentation. Crow's face was very still. Aldridge amended those records on his own authority, he said. The square went quiet in a new way. She almost didn't believe he'd said it. She'd expected denial, clean, complete, confident denial. Not this, not the instant repositioning that meant he'd decided Aldridge was expendable. On his own authority, she said carefully, without your knowledge. County clerks have broad administrative latitude, Crow said. If Aldridge overstepped, then you'll want to explain that to Garrett Birch, she said. He's thorough about these things. Another silence. She could feel the crowd around her. Not a mob, not a surge of collective emotion, but something steadier and more lasting than that. A room full of people who had just heard a powerful man offer up his instrument to save himself and understood exactly what they were watching. Harold Whitmore stepped forward from the edge of the gathering. Everyone looked at him. He looked terrible, pale, underslept, wearing the same clothes he'd had on when she'd knocked on his door that morning. He looked like a man walking into water that was deeper than he was comfortable with, but walking anyway. Victor, he said. His voice shook once and then steadied. You came to me in November 2 years ago, and you told me the payment schedule had been updated by the county office. You told me it was a billing correction. You told me there was nothing to be done about it. He stopped, swallowed. You knew what Aldridge had done because you told him to do it. Crow looked at Harold the way a man looks at something he thought he'd put away that has reappeared inconveniently. Harold, you're confused about... I'm not confused, Harold said. I'm telling you what you said to me, in my kitchen, at my table. He looked at the ground and then back up. In front of my daughter. The words landed in the square and stayed there. Crow said nothing for a moment. He was running calculations. She could almost see it, the same process she ran with columns of figures, except he was running it on people and decisions and the landscape of what was salvageable. This is a family dispute being dressed up as something larger, he said to the crowd. Miss Whitmore has a grievance against her father, and she's been generous in her interpretation of some document irregularities. Mr. Crow, the voice came from behind her, and it was not a voice she recognized. She turned. The man who had spoken was standing at the edge of the square, dismounted, dressed in a plain dark coat with a federal badge on it, and he was looking at Victor Crow with the flat professional attention of a man who has heard exactly enough of the conversation he has just walked into. Garrett Birch had arrived from Helena. Not in 3 days. In 2, which meant he'd ridden hard, which meant the 41 pages had told him something he wanted to act on quickly. He was shorter than she'd imagined from his correspondence, compact, methodical-looking, with spectacles and a traveling bag over his shoulder. He looked like an accountant. He looked like exactly the right person. Victor Crow, Birch said. I'm Garrett Birch, Federal Land Office. I've been corresponding with this office for about 2 years regarding property irregularities in this valley. He looked around the square with the calm, noting expression of a man cataloging. I was planning to arrive tomorrow, but I made better time than expected. He looked at the crowd, at Mara, at the papers in her hand. Miss Whitmore, I received your documentation. Yes, she said. It was thorough. He said it simply, as assessment, not compliment. I'd like to speak with you and with the families represented in your report. I'd also like to speak with the county clerk. His eyes moved to Crow. And I'll need to speak with you, Mr. Crow. Separately. Crow stood very still. Birch looked at him with the equanimity of a man who has done this many times in many places and is not moved by the specific gravity of any particular powerful person. This isn't an arrest, he said. Not yet. This is a formal inquiry. You're welcome to have legal representation present. I know my rights, Crow said. Good, Birch said. Then we'll get started. The inquiry took 4 days. Birch commandeered the back room of the Dust Creek Saloon, the only space large enough, and worked through it with the methodical patience his correspondence had suggested. One family at a time, documents compared, testimony recorded by a stenographer who had ridden down from Helena with him, every figure checked against every other figure until the record was complete. Mara sat in that room for most of 4 days. Not as a witness, her role was the documentation she'd produced, which spoke for itself in ways she was proud of, but as someone who could answer questions about the analysis, who could locate a specific entry in the 41 pages, who could explain the methodology clearly enough for a federal record. Aldridge broke on the second day. She didn't witness it directly. Birch interviewed him privately, but the effect of it moved through the town like a change in weather, everyone feeling the shift before they knew the reason for it. Aldridge had kept his own records, as it turned out, not from guilt or conscience, but from the instinct of a man who knew he was useful to a powerful person and wanted insurance against the day that usefulness ended. He had every instruction Crow had given him, every amendment requested, every timeline. Birch came out of the Aldridge interview with the specific expression of a man who has just received more than he went in looking for. Miss Whitmore, he said, finding her in the saloon, with a cup of coffee and a stack of cross-reference notes. Your analysis of the fraudulent amendment to Vane's homestead filing. How confident are you in the linguistic dating? Very, she said. The phrasing uses terminology that wasn't standard until at least 1884. The filing is dated 1881. I can point you to 3 legitimate 1881-era filings in the county records for comparison, or what's left of them. Aldridge didn't amend everything. Birch nodded. Aldridge confirms it. The Homestead Amendment was created 8 months ago on Crow's instruction. He made a note. The north quarter of the Vane property, similarly. She set down her coffee cup. Elias can get his land back. Both parcels, Birch said, if the evidence holds through the formal proceeding, which I expect it will. He looked at her over his spectacles. How long did it take you to put this together? 3 weeks, she said. Give or take. He looked at her steadily. You should know that the pattern you identified, the due date manipulation specifically, is consistent with a scheme we've been tracking in 2 other counties in the territory. This is not an isolated operation. She absorbed that. How many families in total? Across the 3 counties, our estimate is between 40 and 60. He paused. Your documentation here is the most complete we have. It's going to be the model for how we build the cases in the other counties. She looked at the papers in front of her, the kitchen table at Elias's ranch, the 9 families, the original contracts in their oilcloth wrappers. Good, she said, and she meant it simply. Crow tried to leave on the 3rd day. Not dramatically. He didn't flee in the night or make a scene. He simply arranged his horses and his bags in the early morning with the manner of a man attending to a routine departure, and it was his foreman who noticed and told someone who told Birch. And Birch had 2 words with the man Crow had saddling the horses, and the horses were unsaddled. She heard about it secondhand from June Garrett, who had been in the street when it happened. He didn't argue, June said, just turned around and went back inside, like he'd known it wasn't going to work and tried anyway out of habit. Mara thought that was probably accurate. Men like Crow didn't stop trying their moves just because the board had changed. They played through until the end because that was the habit of power. The reflex of a man who had won enough times that the reflex to try had outlasted the conditions that made winning likely. Elias found her that evening, outside the saloon, standing in the early dark of the square. He came and stood beside her. Birch told me about the land, he said. I know. Both parcels. I know. He was quiet for a moment. You did that, he said. The linguistic dating helped, she said. The Aldridge records helped more. Mara. What? He turned toward her slightly. I'm trying to say something. I can tell, she said. He looked at her. In the dark of the square, she could see his face clearly because the saloon light was behind her, and it caught him. He looked tired in the way of the last 4 days, the deep tiredness of someone who has been holding themselves tightly against the possibility of loss for a sustained period, and is now starting to release it and feeling the weight of what that costs. When I paid for you in this square, he said slowly, I told myself it was just the right thing. Anyone would have done it. They didn't, she said. No, but I told myself that's what it was. A practical decision. The decent thing. He stopped. That's not what it was. She waited. I saw you standing up there, he said, and I don't know how to say this correctly, I saw someone who was exactly who they were in the worst possible circumstance and not hiding from it or going somewhere else inside their head. Just there. Just being exactly who they were. He paused. I'd never seen that before. That specific thing. She thought about standing on the platform, about deciding not to cry, about the interior room she'd gone to, the locked door inside herself. I was hiding, she said. I was very much hiding. No, he said. You were holding. There's a difference. She looked at him. Holding is when you go somewhere inside yourself so you can keep standing up, he said. Hiding is when you go somewhere inside and you don't come back. He met her eyes. You came back. You were already coming back before I said a word. She didn't have an answer to that. She stood with it instead, the way you stand with something that's too large to respond to immediately, that needs time to become part of what you know about yourself. I'm not going to make you a declaration in the middle of Dust Creek, he said. That's not... He almost smiled. That's not how this works. And you've had enough people in the square trying to decide things for you. I've had enough of that everywhere, she said. I know. He looked at the platform and then away from it. I'm just saying that what I feel about you is not the same as what I felt when I paid that $40. It's grown into something else. And I wanted you to know that I know the difference. He paused. When you're ready to have that conversation, I will be too. She looked at him for a long moment. At the face she'd been reading for 3 weeks now, that she could read well enough to know when he was being completely honest as opposed to mostly honest, and this was completely. Ask me again, she said. When this is done. When Birch has his proceedings and Crow's finished and the families have their land back. Ask me then. All right, he said. I'll have a better answer then, she said. Not a different one necessarily, just better. He nodded. The almost smile made it all the way this time briefly, and it changed his face into something younger for a moment. All right. They stood in the square together, not touching, not saying anything else, while the light from the saloon windows lay across the ground between them and the square of Dust Creek held itself in the ordinary quiet of an evening that had nothing particular to announce. 40 feet away, the platform stood where it had always stood. She looked at it once. She was done with it. On the fourth day, Birch completed his formal inquiry and sealed his records. He met with Mara that morning over coffee, real coffee, the saloon's, which was better than anything she'd been drinking for weeks, and went through his findings with the brisk efficiency of a man who has done this so many times, the summary comes naturally. Crow would be formally charged. The charges would be substantial: fraud, conspiracy, property theft through document manipulation, at minimum. The proceedings would happen in Helena, not Dust Creek, which meant a territorial court and a judge who was not in Crow's pocket. Aldridge would cooperate in exchange for reduced charges. His records were, as it turned out, meticulous to the point of self-condemnation. The man had documented everything, every instruction, every amended filing, every payment Crow had made to him across 4 years, kept in a locked box under his office floor with the instinct of a man who understood that his safety lay in being more useful alive and cooperative than buried. The 9 families would have their debts reassessed against their original contracts. Overpayments would be calculated. Repayments were not guaranteed in the short term. The legal process was slow, and Birch was honest about that. But the framework was clear. What had been taken would be returned in time through process. Elias's land, both the north quarter and the parcel claimed under the fraudulent Homestead Amendment, would be restored to the original deed. The other counties, Mara said. You said this pattern exists in 2 others. It does, Birch said. We'll be building those cases now, using your methodology. If you need someone who knows the methodology, I was going to ask, he said. He looked at her over his spectacles with the direct manner she'd come to associate with him in 4 days. Not immediately. The Helena proceedings will take several months. But after, the work of reconstructing the other cases is going to require someone who can do what you did here. Read the records the right way. Find the pattern. She thought about the ranch north of Dust Creek, about the kitchen table in the morning light, and Tobias's voice informing her that the biscuits were not good, but there were a lot of them. Write to me, she said. When you know the timing, I'll let you know. He nodded. I will. She picked up her coffee. It was better than she'd expected, which was a small and specific pleasure in the context of everything else, and she let herself have it without apology. Outside the saloon window, Dust Creek was beginning its ordinary morning. The hardware store opening, someone crossing the square with a package, a child running for no apparent reason in the way of children who run because they can. The platform stood at the far end in the early light, unremarkable, a piece of civic furniture with a dog sleeping under it again. She looked at it. She thought, 3 weeks ago I stood on that and decided not to cry. She thought, I've been making decisions since then, one after another, every day, more decisions in a direction I chose. She thought, this is what it feels like. She drank her coffee. She was ready to go home. The ride back to the ranch was quieter than the ride into town had been 4 days earlier, but it was a different kind of quiet, not the taut, forward-leaning silence of people moving towards something uncertain, but the looser quiet of people who have been through something together and are letting it settle into its proper shape. Tobias had been watching from the fence again. She could see him from a quarter-mile out, the small figure at the gate, and she thought, he's been doing that every day, probably morning and afternoon. Probably told Cutter he was checking the road for some practical reason that Cutter had the grace to accept without comment. When they rode in, Tobias looked at both of them, a fast, complete assessment, and said, Did it work? Yes, Elias said. Tobias exhaled. It was a short sound, almost nothing, but it was 4 days of held breath in it. Good, he said. Then, Cutter fixed the water tank. I know, Elias said. He told me when he came back. I helped. I know that too. Tobias held the gate open and then fell into step beside the horses as they walked to the rail, and Mara listened to him talk about the water tank, about one of the mares who'd been off her feed, about a letter that had arrived from someone in Billings that he'd left on the desk. And she thought about what it meant that a 12-year-old boy had spent 4 days holding a ranch and its secrets with the steadiness of someone twice his age, and had greeted their return by telling them about the water tank. He had needed something useful to do with the fear. So he'd done useful things. She understood that completely. Tobias, she said, climbing down. He looked up at her. You did well, she said. Not good job or I'm proud of you. The phrases that adults use when they're talking down to children. Just, you did well. The way you'd say it to anyone who had. He looked at her for a moment. The gap in his teeth showed when he almost smiled and then pulled it back to something more contained. I know, he said, and went to help with the horses. The weeks that followed were not easy in the way that people sometimes imagine resolution to be easy. The false idea that when the fight ends, the damage repairs itself cleanly, the way a bone is supposed to heal straight if it's set right. Real healing is slower and stranger than that, and it moves in directions you don't always anticipate. The Garrett family got their overpayment calculation from Birch's office 6 weeks after the inquiry closed. The number was smaller than Thomas had hoped, and larger than June had let herself expect. And they sat with it at their kitchen table, and June cried briefly, and Thomas didn't, and then they made a list of what needed fixing on the property first. Mara knew this because June told her, directly, without dressing it up as anything other than what it was. Clara Sims got her original loan declared satisfied, paid in full under the corrected terms, and the relief of it took 2 months to become real to her, to convert from a legal fact into something she actually believed when she woke in the morning. Margaret Hollis and her husband got the right-of-way dispute resolved in their favor, the false easement removed from the county record, their south field restored to what it had always been on the ground, but had stopped being on paper. Margaret came to the ranch to tell Mara personally, which Mara had not expected. I want to say something, Margaret said, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee she hadn't touched yet. About the day in the square, when I looked away from you. You don't need, Mara started. I know I don't need to, Margaret said. I want to. She looked at her hands. I told myself I didn't know what was happening, that I wasn't sure, that it wasn't my place to... She stopped. That's not true. I knew. I just decided it wasn't my problem yet, and I've thought about that every day since. Mara looked at her. Margaret Hollis was in her 40s with the weathered competence of a woman who had been doing hard work for a long time and had developed opinions about most things. The admission had cost her something real. Thank you for telling me, Mara said. I'm sorry, Margaret said. I know, Mara said, and she meant it, not as absolution, not as the waving away of a thing that hadn't mattered. Just, I believe you, I hear you, we can go forward from here. Margaret picked up her coffee. They sat for a while in the ordinary companionship of 2 women at a table, which was its own kind of thing, unremarkable and not unremarkable at all. Victor Crow's formal proceedings happened in Helena over the course of 3 months. Mara was called to testify once, in the 5th week, and she rode up with Elias and spent 2 days in the territorial court explaining her methodology to a judge, who asked precise questions and listened to the answers without expression. Crow sat across the room in good clothes with a lawyer from back east who had learned, by the 2nd day of Mara's testimony, to stop trying to find holes in the arithmetic. Numbers are stubborn that way. They don't respond to rhetoric. Aldridge testified for 4 days. His records were entered into evidence, and the judge looked at them for a very long time without speaking. The sentence came down on a Tuesday in early spring. Fraud, property theft by document manipulation, conspiracy. Crow would serve time in the territorial prison, the amount depending on the appellate process, which his lawyer was already preparing. His assets, the land he had accumulated through fraudulent claims, the properties he held under illegitimate debt enforcement, were to be assessed and the proceeds distributed to the families named in the case. It was not perfect justice. Mara understood that. The money wouldn't cover everything. The years of fear couldn't be returned. Some of the Alderson land had been resold, and the chain of title was going to take more legal work to unwind than Birch had initially estimated. The process was slow, and the law was imprecise, and the world did not reorganize itself cleanly just because someone proved it had been wrong. But it was real. It was documented. It was done in front of witnesses and entered into a formal record that could not be amended by a county clerk with a pen and an employer. She sat in the back of the courtroom and listened to the sentence read and felt something that was not quite triumph and not quite relief. Something quieter than both. The satisfaction of a thing completed. The specific weight of having carried something to its end. Elias was beside her. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Harold Whitmore came to the ranch in late March. She had not invited him and she had not forbidden him, which she supposed was its own kind of answer to a question he'd been sitting with for months. He came on foot. He had sold the horse sometime in the winter. And he came in the morning and he stood at the gate without coming through it, which she respected more than she expected to. She went out to meet him. He looked better than he had in December when she'd knocked on his door in Dust Creek. Some of the stale, closed-room quality was gone. He was still thin and his hair was still going gray faster than his age warranted, but he was standing up straight, which was something. "I heard about Helena," he said. "Yes," she said. "I wanted—" He stopped, started again. "I don't know what I'm asking for. I'm not asking you to pretend it didn't happen. I know I can't—" He put his hands in his coat pockets. "I testified. At Birch's inquiry. I don't know if that helps anything." "It helped," she said. "The testimony mattered." "Good." He looked past her at the ranch, the rebuilt barn frame, the fence lines, the morning activity of a working operation. "You've built something here." "Elias built this," she said. "You're part of it now," Harold said. "Not as a challenge, just as observation, the kind that comes from a man trying to see what's in front of him without filtering it through what he needs it to be." She looked at him, at her father, at this complicated and failed and recognizable man who had done the worst thing he'd ever done to her and had known it was wrong before he did it, and had done it anyway, which was its own kind of tragedy that she'd spent months trying to locate correctly. She had not forgiven him. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself. Forgiveness was not something she'd arrived at, and she wasn't sure it was the right destination or whether forgiveness was even the point. What she'd arrived at was something more like understanding, the cold, clear-eyed understanding of someone who has looked at a person's choices and can see the fear and weakness inside them without those things making the choices acceptable. He was her father. He had failed her in the largest possible way. Both of those things were true at the same time and always would be. "Harold," she said. He looked at her. "Don't do it again," she said. "Whatever comes next, whatever hard thing comes, don't make the coward's choice." She paused. "Not because of me. Because you have to live with yourself. And I think the living with yourself has been the hard part." He was quiet for a long moment. Something moved through his face that she didn't look away from. "Yes," he said. "It has." "Then do better," she said. "That's all." She went back inside. She left the gate open, and after a while she heard him walk away, and she stood at the kitchen window and watched him go, and she held the complicated weight of what he was without trying to make it lighter than it was. Tobias appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Was that your father?" "Yes." "Did you yell at him?" "No." He considered this. "Are you going to?" "No," she said. "I said what needed saying." Tobias looked out the window at the road Harold had taken. "My mother sent a letter last year," he said. "First one in 4 years. My dad let me read it." She turned to look at him. He was leaning against the door frame with his arms crossed, looking at the road, not at her. "What did you do with it?" she asked. "Read it 3 times," he said. "Put it in the box under my bed." He paused. "I don't know what it means yet. Whether it means anything." He looked at her. "Does that make sense?" "Yes," she said. "That makes complete sense." He nodded, satisfied with this, and pushed off the doorframe and went back to whatever he'd been doing, and she turned back to the window and thought about the things people carry in boxes under beds, The letters and the contracts and the documents and the weights that don't resolve cleanly and maybe don't need to, that just need to be held correctly until you understand what they mean. Spring came to the high country slowly, which was always how it came, not arriving so much as gradually overtaking winter's claim, one morning at a time, the light lasting a little longer each day, the ground giving a little more under boots than it had the day before. The North Quarter came back in April, the deed restored by federal order, the survey markers reset. Elias rode the boundary on a Sunday afternoon and didn't say much when he came back, but he was different that evening in a way that was hard to articulate, more at rest somehow. Like a piece of himself that had been slightly out of place had returned to where it belonged. The second parcel came through in May. Mara started teaching in June. It had not been a formal plan. It had grown from a conversation with Clara Sims, who had mentioned that there were 4 children in the valley whose nearest school was a half-day's ride away, and whose parents had been making do with what they could teach at home. One of those children was 12 and had never learned to read. One was 8 and could do her sums, but had no language for what she was doing or why it worked. Mara said she had a kitchen table in a morning. By the end of the first week, there were 6 children. By the end of the month, 9. By fall, 14 coming from 3 different directions, some of them riding distances that spoke to how much their parents wanted this for them and how little they'd had access to before. She taught reading and arithmetic. She taught the older ones to read a contract, which she considered the most important thing she could give anyone in this valley at this particular moment in its history. The ability to look at a document and know what it said and whether what it said matched what they'd agreed to. She was not a natural teacher in the patient, gentle sense. She had a directness that occasionally startled the younger children and that she had to consciously soften. But she was good at explaining. She was good at finding the shape of a concept that would fit inside a particular child's existing understanding. She was good at taking numbers off the page and making them mean something in the world, which was the thing about mathematics that most schools forgot to teach. Tobias sat in on the lessons sometimes, ostensibly to help with the younger ones, actually because he liked it, which was something he would never have admitted directly, but which was visible to anyone watching. "You're good with them," Mara told him one afternoon after the children had left. "I just explain things," he said. "That's what teaching is," she said. He looked at her with the skeptical expression of a boy who suspects he's being managed toward something. "Are you saying I should be a teacher?" "I'm saying you're good at it," she said. "What you do with that is your business." He thought about it. "I want to be a lawyer," he said. "I've been thinking about it for a while." She looked at him. 13 now, growing fast, the gap in his teeth filled in over the winter by a new tooth that had come in slightly crooked and suited him. "Why a lawyer?" "Because what happened to the families in this valley, Crow could do that because nobody in the valley understood the law well enough to fight back with it," he said. "Even you. You did it with numbers. But if someone had known what questions to ask earlier, legally..." He stopped. It could have been stopped sooner. She looked at him for a long moment. "You're right," she said. "I know," he said. She smiled at that, at the echo of herself in him, the straightforwardness of it, the complete absence of false modesty. "Your father know you're thinking about this?" "I told him last week." "What did he say?" "He said he'd figure out how to pay for it." Tobias paused. He said it like it was already decided, like all he had to do was work out the details. She looked out the kitchen window at the yard where Elias was talking to Cutter about something near the fence line, both of them looking at the same spot in the fence with the focused attention of men who have found a problem and are debating its solution. "That sounds like him," she said. It was an evening in late September when Elias finally asked. They were on the porch in the last light, the specific September light of high country that has a quality unlike any other month, cleaner and more particular. The kind of light that makes the distances visible in a way that summer haze doesn't allow. Tobias was inside. The ranch was settling into its evening sounds. Elias said, "You told me to ask again when it was done." She looked at him. "I did." "It's done," he said. She let the evening hold for a moment, the fence lines, the hills going blue in the distance, the sound of one of the horses in the paddock, all of it familiar now, settled into her daily sense of the world. You said your feelings had grown into something else, she said. Since the square. Yes. Tell me what it is now, she said. Specifically, not what it was in October, what it is now. He was quiet for a moment, in the way she'd learned meant he was looking for the accurate thing rather than the easy thing. He stopped. You know when you've been looking for something for a long time and you find it, and it's not what you pictured, but it's exactly what you needed? It's that. She turned to look at him fully. That's not very romantic, Elias. No, he agreed, but it's true. It is, she said. She had thought about this for months, not whether she felt what she felt. That had been clear to her for a long time, in the way that clear things are sometimes the last ones you let yourself name, but what it meant to choose it. She had spent her life before the platform being moved by other people's decisions. She had spent the months since learning, decision by decision, what it felt like to move herself. Choosing this was different from the other choices. It was choosing to be known by someone, to let someone's life matter to yours in the particular way of people who have decided to build something together. That was a different order of vulnerability than fighting Victor Crow, or testifying in Helena, or standing in a square and saying what was true. She had thought about whether she was ready for it. She thought, I will never be completely ready. That is true of all worthwhile things. I'm not easy to know, she said. I want you to understand that. Not as a warning, just as information. I have rooms inside me I keep locked for a long time before I let anyone near them. I'm working on that, but I'm not done working on it. I know, he said. I'm not asking for the locked rooms. I'm asking for the company of the person who has them. She looked at him, at the face she knew well now. The angles of it, the way tiredness showed in the set of his jaw, the rare quality of his smile. At the man who had asked her, what do you want in a square full of people who were treating her like a thing with a price, and had meant it simply, and had been waiting ever since for the answer she was ready to give. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes to what, specifically? To being courted slowly, she said, with no demands and no assumptions. She paused. And yes to what it will probably become if you do it right. The almost smile came all the way this time. Stayed. I'll do my best, he said. I know, she said. That's why I said yes. They sat on the porch in the September light and didn't say anything else for a while. And the silence between them was the good kind. The kind that is full rather than empty. That has the weight of two people who know each other well enough that the quiet is part of the conversation. Inside Tobias's voice, informing someone, the stove, she thought, or possibly a book, that it was wrong about something. And he had the evidence. There are things that Mara Whitmore understood about value by the end of that year that she had not understood at the beginning. She understood that value is not set by the person who names a price. A man can stand in a square and call a number, and the number is real only if the person being priced accepts the accounting. She had not accepted it, even when she had no way to refuse it, and that refusal, interior, invisible, known only to herself, had been the beginning of everything that came after. She understood that the things people protect reveal more about who they are than the things they display. The families of this valley had kept their original contracts in oilcloth wrappers, under beds, in locked boxes, in the bottoms of trunks, long after the world had told them those contracts were superseded. They had not stopped believing in what they'd agreed to, even when an official document told them their memory was wrong. That faith in their own original understanding was not stubbornness. It was integrity, small and quiet and unkillable. She understood that the worst damage coercion does is not the immediate loss, the land, the money, the thing taken. The worst damage is what it does to a person's sense of what is possible. The families in this valley had stopped imagining certain futures because imagining them hurt too much, and Crow had understood this and relied on it. The real crime was not the amended records. The real crime was the imagination he had stolen. She understood that people who have been through hard things together develop a specific kind of loyalty that is not romantic and is not familial and is not professional. It is something else, something that does not have a clean name, that is built from the particular intimacy of having seen each other in the worst possible circumstances and choosing to stay. She understood that she had built a life, not from what she'd been given. She had been given very little that was useful, from what she'd done, from the decisions she'd made in the weeks after a platform, each one leading to the next, none of them perfect, all of them hers. She was still imperfect. She knew that. She had a temper that ran cold rather than hot, which was sometimes harder to recognize than the loud kind. She carried things alone longer than she should before letting anyone help. She was better with numbers than with the words she needed in emotional moments, and she was aware of this deficit without having fully corrected it. She was also, and she had learned to let this be true without qualifying it immediately, which had taken real practice, capable. Brave in the specific way of people who are afraid and continue anyway. Worth knowing. She had not needed someone to tell her this. She had needed the circumstances and the time to see it herself, which is the only way it actually takes. The world will put a price on you. Someone will name a number, attach it to your name, say it in public with the confidence of a person who has decided the accounting is complete. The only answer that matters is the one you give yourself. Not loudly, not necessarily in front of anyone. Just the interior decision, made in whatever room you've retreated to, in whatever darkness you're holding yourself together inside. The decision that the number is wrong, that the accounting doesn't include everything, that whoever you are is not finalized by what someone else was willing to pay. Mara Whitmore had made that decision on a platform in Dust Creek, in the worst moment of her life, standing in a gray dress that hung loose at the shoulders. She had made it quietly, invisibly, with no audience. And then she had come down off the platform and started proving it, one day at a time, one number at a time, in a kitchen that became hers, and a valley that learned to trust her name, and a life that no one had handed to her and no one could take away. The high country light came in the kitchen window every morning, same as it always had, falling across the table where the papers lived and the coffee cooled, and a boy who was going to be a lawyer argued with anyone who'd engage him. And a man came in from the yard with mud on his boots and a problem that needed solving, and the day was ordinary and specific and entirely her own. She had earned that. Not because someone decided she deserved it, because she had decided, and she had not stopped.